Iran is one of the most paradoxical countries in the world. Its ancestors created the glorious ancient Persian Empire, yet today the country follows the religion that once conquered it. Its national language is Persian, but its most sacred scriptures must be recited in Arabic. It is the heart and stronghold of Shia Islam worldwide, yet Shia Islam first originated in the deserts of Arabia, and not on the Persian plateau. It is a mortal enemy of Israel, yet 2,500 years ago, it was the Persian king who personally freed the Jews from captivity. What about the Middle East today? In every conflict, there are missile exchanges between Israel and Iran, the 1,000-year-old feud between Sunnis and Shiites, Iranian proxies harassing the Gulf states, and Iran's nuclear threat to the entire world. If we only look at today's news, we may never truly understand it. But if we zoom out and look back to the Iranian plateau 2,500 years ago, you'll realize that all the rifts in the Middle East today were already sown long ago. Today, let's dig into this topic. Starting from the very beginning, we'll talk about Iran, from the glory of ancient Persia, how it was conquered and transformed, and how it gradually became the root of all evil in the Middle East today. If you enjoy stories that look at current affairs through the lens of history, remember to give us a like and subscribe to Zhengguandian. Because in the coming period, we will gradually unravel and explain Iran's more than 2,000 years of history to you, layer by layer. At the end of the 7th century BC, the Iranian plateau was swept by wind and sand, filled with nomadic tribes constantly at war with each other. At that time, Iran was not yet a country. The most powerful people on this land were the Medes. The Medes and the Persians were actually relatives. Both were Indo-European peoples who had migrated from Central Asia to the Iranian plateau 2,000 years earlier. They spoke similar languages and worshipped the forces of nature. They lived by herding, hunting, and a bit of agriculture. In 612 BC, the king of Media seized an opportunity. At that time, the dominant power in the Middle East, the Assyrian Empire, was collapsing. The Medes joined forces with Babylon and invaded the Assyrian capital, Nineveh. Assyria was destroyed, and this war left a huge power vacuum in history. Next, it was the Persians' turn to rise. The protagonist of this story is named Cyrus. Around 600 BC, Cyrus was born. He grew up in the Median royal palace, learning horsemanship, archery, warfare, and how to govern a country. But he had a problem. He wasn't a Median, he was a Persian. At that time, Persia was just a subordinate tribe under the Median kingdom. In other words, Cyrus grew up in the enemy's palace. By 559 BC, Cyrus inherited the throne of Anshan in Persia. Many people thought he would continue to serve as a vassal to the Medes. But 3 years later, he rebelled. In 550 BC, on the plains of Pasargadae, Cyrus launched a surprise attack. At that time, the Median army was already dissatisfied with their king, and many generals directly defected to Cyrus. The war was over almost overnight. The Median Empire fell, and the Persian Empire was born. In the following 30 years, Cyrus swept through Lydia, Babylon, and other nations one after another, incorporating them into the Persian territory. Soon, an empire unprecedented in human history emerged. How big was the Persian Empire? Many history books give a bunch of numbers. 50 million people, 27 provinces. But these figures are hard for us to truly imagine. So, to put it another way, at that time, the Persian Empire stretched from the Mediterranean in the west to India in the east, bordered the Caucasus in the north, and reached the Persian Gulf and Egypt in the south. If you lived 2,600 years ago, starting from what is now Israel, and walked all the way to Pakistan, you would very likely remain within the same country the entire time. And the one who ruled over all of this was a single person, the Persian king, the king of kings. Never before had any civilization managed such vast lands, such a huge population, and so many groups with different languages and beliefs. The key point is that the Persian Empire governed all of this extremely well. For example, in an era without telegraphs or railways, spanning 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, even just transmitting information was a tremendous challenge. So how did the Persians do it? They built a road called the Royal Road, stretching 2,400 kilometers. It ran from Asia Minor all the way to the heartland of Persia, with relay stations set up at intervals along the route. When the messenger arrived at a relay station, he would change horses, but not riders, racing ahead to deliver the message. According to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, it took only 7 days for a message to travel across the entire Persian Empire. You could think of it as the internet infrastructure of that era. In addition, Persia unified its currency, built underground canals to irrigate the desert, and allowed different ethnic groups to preserve their own religions and cultures. But what truly made Cyrus go down in history was something else. In 539 BC, after he captured Babylon, he released many people from conquered nations who had been imprisoned at the time, including the Jews who had been held captive for nearly 50 years. Decades earlier, the Neo-Babylonian Empire had captured Jerusalem and taken the Jews to Babylon, forcing them to leave their homeland and live in a foreign land. For a full half-century, after Cyrus entered Babylon, he immediately announced that the conquered peoples could return to their own lands and restore their religions. The Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Later, Cyrus issued another decree inscribed on a clay cylinder in cuneiform script, stating, "I do not force anyone to change their faith. I respect the gods of every nation." This clay cylinder is now housed in the British Museum and is known as the Cyrus Cylinder. Many historians regard it as the first declaration of human rights in human history. And this was 2,300 years before the birth of the American Declaration of Independence. However, Cyrus's tolerance did not come out of nowhere. It was supported by an entire system of thought behind him. This was a belief system that originated on the Iranian plateau, even older than the Achaemenid Empire. It is called Zoroastrianism, also known in Chinese as the fire-worshipping religion or the ancient religion. The prophet Zoroaster lived around 1500 BC. Its core belief, in today's terms, is that the world is an eternal battle between good and evil. The good god is called Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, and the evil god is called Angra Mainyu, the spirit of destruction. Every person and every choice made each day is taking a side in this war between good and evil. This concept is quite thought-provoking even in the modern world, and I think it sounds pretty good. Friends, what do you think? Leave me a comment and let me know. Many people, when they first see the religious relics of Persia, notice one thing in particular, the fire altar. Many tourists ask, do Persians worship fire? Actually, they don't worship fire itself. Persians were never that primitive. What fire represents is purity, truth, and light, which are the core values of Zoroastrianism. As long as the sacred fire does not go out, it means that the power of good is always present. So this religion has a very simple principle: good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Many scholars of religion believe that many concepts found later in Western religions actually originated from Zoroastrianism, such as heaven, hell, the final judgment, and even the image of Satan. All of these can find their roots in Zoroastrianism. So within this kind of civilization, at the very root of this culture, it also explains why Cyrus was able to possess such a level of tolerance that transcended his era. The core of Zoroastrianism is respect for individual choice. Goodness cannot be forced, it can only inspire. A ruler who truly believes in this philosophy would never use coercion to govern his people. And this is precisely the root of Persian civilization. For more than 100 years that followed, the Persian Empire remained at the pinnacle of civilization until one man appeared. His name was Xerxes. Xerxes was the son of Darius I. The empire he inherited was already the largest political entity in human history at that time. By all rights, simply holding on would have been a victory, but Xerxes had a lingering concern, and that was Greece. His father Darius had been caught off guard and utterly humiliated by a group of Greek infantry at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Xerxes wanted revenge. In 480 BC, he launched one of the largest military campaigns in ancient human history. He ordered the construction of 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, which is known today as the Dardanelles Strait, linking ships end to end and laying wooden planks over them, allowing his massive army to march from Asia into the European continent. According to Greek historical records, his army numbered as many as 1 million men. Later, many historians believed this was an exaggeration, but in reality, it still reached 200,000 to 300,000. For the Greek city-states at that time, it was still an overwhelming force. He burned Athens, set fire to the Acropolis, and completed the revenge his father had left unfinished. But then, the tide of the war began to turn. In the Battle of Salamis, the Athenian navy used their more agile ships to lure the vast Persian fleet into a narrow strait, where they defeated them one by one, leaving the Persian forces in disarray. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, the Persian army suffered another defeat. Xerxes was forced to withdraw his troops and never returned again. On the surface, this was merely a military defeat, but in reality, it exposed deeper issues within the Persian Empire at the time. The empire had become too vast, too unwieldy, its front lines stretched too far, making logistics difficult to sustain, and internal conflicts among the nobility began to ferment. In the 150 years following Xerxes, the Achaemenid Empire was There was no further expansion. Instead, the empire was slowly consuming itself. By the time the last king, Darius III, ascended the throne, the empire still appeared vast and magnificent, but in reality it had become a hollow shell. It was a giant rotten from within, and at this very moment a new figure appeared on the stage of history. A man named Alexander the Great of Macedonia, ascended the throne at the age of 20 and began his eastern campaign at 22. His teacher was Aristotle, and he grew up reading Homer's epics, firmly believing himself to be a descendant of the gods. He was perhaps one of the most charismatic conquerors in human history. Friends, do you agree with my assessment? If you do, give me a like to let me know. The next 3 battles completely changed the world order. The first battle was the Battle of the Granicus River, where Alexander personally led the cavalry charge and the Persian defenders were quickly defeated. The second was the Battle of Issus, where this time Darius III himself took the field. As for Alexander, he arranged his cavalry into a triangular wedge formation, slicing straight into the center of the Persian army like a blade. Seeing the situation collapse, the king could only flee on horseback, not even having time to take his own mother with him. His wife and daughter as well. But what truly determined the fate of the Persian Empire was the third battle, the Battle of Gaugamela. In 331 BC, Darius III gathered the empire's last remaining strength, hundreds of thousands of troops, chariots, and even war elephants. This was the Persian Empire's final and largest military mobilization. Alexander's tactics, however, remained very simple. He led his cavalry straight into the center of the enemy lines because he knew that as long as the king fled, the war would be over. Sure enough, not long after the battle began, Darius III once again turned and ran. In 330 BC, during his escape, Darius III was assassinated by his own general, Bessus. An emperor who had ruled half the world died at the hands of a traitor, collapsing by the side of a desolate road. It is said that by the time Alexander arrived, he was already a corpse. Alexander took off his own cloak and covered his body with it. Then Alexander the Great arrived at Persepolis. This palace had been the heart of the Achaemenid Empire for 200 years. Darius III and Xerxes spent decades building it, and its reliefs were filled with depictions of envoys from 27 nations. Each one tells the story of the entire world coming here to bow before the king. Alexander the Great set it ablaze with a single fire. According to historical records, this was revenge for the Greco-Persian Wars, a repayment for the burning of Athens. But some historians say it was nothing more than a drunken bonfire party that got out of control. Whatever the reason, that fire burned for several days. 350 years of Persian imperial memory collapsed in the flames. When the fire died out, the throne had turned to ashes, the most glorious chapter of Persian civilization. It all ended in a great fire. But Alexander did not stop there. He continued his eastward campaign, fighting all the way to the Indus River. However, Alexander's empire did not last long either. In 323 BC, Alexander died suddenly. and this super empire spanning 3 continents fractured almost overnight with his passing. His generals began to fight over the territories. Some seized Egypt, others took control of Asia Minor. The Iranian plateau fell into the hands of one general, whose name was Seleucus. He founded a state which would later become the Seleucid Empire that ruled this land for more than 200 years. From this moment on, Iran entered a new era, the Hellenistic Age. Greek became the administrative language. Greek cities were established throughout Iran, and Greek culture, art, and philosophy continuously poured into this land. Yet the Persians, who had once built a world empire, were gradually marginalized on their own land. They became sidelined, but history would not simply end there, because on the fringes of the empire, an Iranian cavalry tribe was quietly rising. They were called the Parthians. They would ignite the flame of the first revival of Persian civilization. The Parthians were originally a nomadic tribe living in northeastern Iran, riding horses, shooting arrows, and moving with the water and grass. They were not as splendid as the Persian nobility, nor did they possess the urban civilization of the Greeks, but they had something that was the most terrifying weapon of that era: cavalry, specifically a combination of heavy cavalry and mounted archers. Their tactics were simple, yet deadly. They could retreat while turning back to shoot arrows. That's why history has left us with a term, Parthian shot, which means being able to accurately kill pursuers even while retreating. Around 247 BC, the leader of the Parthian tribe, Xerxes, I launched a rebellion, overthrowing the Seleucid Empire's local governor and establishing a new dynasty, which history calls the Parthian Empire. They had a very clear goal: to revive Persia. So they reinstated an ancient title, King of Kings, which was the royal title of the former Persian Empire. In the following centuries, the Parthian Empire gradually expanded, controlling the Iranian plateau, the Mesopotamian region, and key points along the Silk Road. Trade flourished once again, and silk from the east entered the Roman world through Parthia. But the Parthians soon encountered a new opponent, one that would become their archenemy for centuries: the Roman Empire. In 53 BC, the Roman Republic sent a very famous general named Crassus, who was one of the wealthiest men in Rome at the time, and a political ally of Caesar and Pompey. At that time, the Romans were almost invincible. Gaul had been conquered, and the Mediterranean had become a Roman lake. Crassus thought the east would be just as easy, so he set out with 7 legions, about 40,000 soldiers. He marched grandly into Mesopotamia, originally thinking this would be an easy conquest. But this turned out to be one of the most shocking defeats in Roman history. This battle completely changed the Romans' perception of warfare in the east. It was the Battle of Carrhae. The battlefield was at a place called Carrhae, near present-day Turkey and Syria. The Roman legions formed into a square formation, creating a wall of steel with their shields and long spears. This was Rome's most classic tactic, almost invincible and undefeated throughout Europe. But the Parthians did not launch a frontal assault. Instead, they did something the Romans had never seen before and could not have anticipated. They sent out several thousand mounted archers to circle around the Roman formation. They circled and rained down arrows. The Roman soldiers raised their shields to defend themselves, but the Parthians never came close. They were constantly on the move. When the Romans gave chase, the Parthians would immediately retreat, then turn back and continue shooting arrows. This is the most famous Parthian archery tactic. For the first time, the Roman legions discovered that their steel phalanx was completely powerless on the open plains. Even more deadly, the Parthians also had heavily armored cavalry, with both riders and horses clad in armor. After the Roman formations were weakened by the rain of arrows, these cavalry would suddenly charge, causing the battlefield to collapse in an instant. The result was predictable and extremely tragic. The Roman legions were almost completely wiped out. 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed and 10,000 were captured. The Roman commander Crassus was killed during negotiations. Legend has it that the Parthians poured molten gold into his mouth to mock his greed for wealth. This was the most humiliating defeat in Roman history. After the Battle of Carrhae, Rome finally realized that the East was not a land easily conquered. The Parthian Empire became one of Rome's strongest adversaries, and a border stretching thousands of kilometers was established between the two great empires. From Syria to Armenia, wars broke out intermittently, and this standoff lasted for nearly 300 years. During this period, the Parthian Empire was also gradually changing. As their rule became increasingly lax, the power of the nobility grew stronger, and the central royal authority began to weaken. History seemed to be repeating itself once again. After becoming powerful, an empire slowly began to show cracks. At this very moment, a new force emerged in the south of the Iranian plateau. They claimed to be the true heirs of Persia, and their name was the Sassanid dynasty. This dynasty would bring about a revolution that would completely change the fate of Iran. In their hands, Persia would not only be revived, but would also become more radical and more religious. This, in turn, planted a significant foreshadowing for the future history of Iran. In the next episode, we will talk about the glory and shortcomings of the Sassanids, and how a storm blowing in from the Arabian desert forever changed the face of Iran.